of opinion. I already said that one. Thank you for recording. Stay on mute when you're not speaking. So that's a funny one for people virtually. That makes a lot of sense. For people in the room, we also ask that you be on mute when you're not speaking. So no side conversations. It's really distracting and makes it hard for people to hear. Refrain from sidebar conversations and provide input via the online survey, all the ways that I've just explained. So with that, what I would like to do now is introduce Ivan, who's going to introduce his staff from Water Resources and share some context and welcoming remarks. Ivan?
Thanks, Jamie. Appreciate it. My name is Ivan Gall. I'm the division administrator for our field services division. And I guess effective October 1st, I'll be acting deputy director for the water management side of our agency here in the state. I'll go around the room real quickly and look at field staff. First off is Doug Woodcock, acting director for the agency. Parker Beeblehouse in the back is an assistant water master here in our Salem office. Travis Brown and Mike Toma at the back, both hydrogeologists with our groundwater section. Annette Leva is our division administrator for the technical services division, of which the groundwater section is part. And then of course, Justin Iverson is our manager for the groundwater section, and he'll be giving the bulk of the presentation this evening. What we're really here to do tonight is to seek feedback, comments, input from all of you on opportunities and options for a groundwater allocation process update here in the state. We want to modernize that process to be more protective of senior users in the state and to be more sustainable with our groundwater aquifer systems around the state as well. The existing system, which has been in place for a number of years, doesn't fully protect senior users, and it's led to unsustainable allocation of groundwater in some basins across the state. I want to touch a little bit about what this process is going to address and deal with and what it's not, just so everybody is clear about that. We are going to be talking about, and this process is about, assessing water availability for new groundwater rights. It's also going to contribute to protection of senior users, both surface water users and groundwater users across the state, and improving groundwater sustainability. What this is not going to do is affect exempt groundwater use or exempt wells. And I'll talk a little bit more about those so everybody's clear about what exempt groundwater use is. This is not going to affect regulation of existing water rights in the state. And this is also not going to have any effect on the water right transfer process. Transfers, of course, are mechanisms by which people can alter their existing water rights in a number of different ways. Let's see, next slide. So I mentioned exempt groundwater uses. These are traditionally domestic wells. Oregon water law allows a series of exemptions from groundwater. I've got them listed here on the slide, the major ones. Typically, 15,000 gallons a day are allowed for single or group domestic uses. You can also use up to 5,000 gallons per day for industrial or commercial uses. Stock water is exempt. And then irrigation of up to 1/2 acre of lawn or non-commercial garden is another exempt use. These are all uses that are allowed in Oregon without needing to apply for a groundwater right and to go through the groundwater allocation process. So the process we'll be talking about tonight does not impact these. Let's see. Want to set the timeline a little bit for sort of where we've been, where we are, and where we're heading. This process started about a year ago. This is a top priority for our Water Resources Commission. Last winter, Justin and others started presenting information on the groundwater allocation process and having discussions with the Water Resources Commission. Earlier this spring here in 2022, staff convened for a number of meetings and started discussing concepts to look at different approaches for a groundwater allocation process. This summer, Commission directed us to gather additional public input, and that's really where we are tonight. This is the first of 5 meetings we'll be holding Next week will be in Bend and LeGrand. The following week will be in Medford. And then October 10th is the last meeting. That'll just be a virtual only meeting that will run here out of Salem again. But we're again reaching out to folks to get input and feedback on this process. Later this fall, we'll incorporate the comments and the feedback that we've gotten and start drafting new rules or modifications to existing rules to modernize our groundwater allocation approach. Moving forward into the winter, we'll look at convening a rule advisory committee to have a number of meetings to go through those rules, again, soliciting additional feedback, comments. And the ultimate goal is to bring a set of proposed rules to the Water Resources Commission sometime in the spring next year for adoption. So with that, I want to turn it over to Justin Iverson. He's going to be presenting information tonight in his presentation, giving us a quick rundown on key concepts in groundwater hydrology. He'll talk in more detail about our existing allocation process that we've been using for decades. And then we'll present some ideas and concepts to you all for consideration on possible solutions for modernization of this project. So with that, Justin.
Yeah, actually, Ivan, if I can step in just a minute. Thank you, Ivan. So for folks in the room and for people online, Justin's presentation goes till about 6:45. And we ask that you hold your questions until the end. The first part of the Q&A time that we have is to ask for clarifying questions. So if you can hold your questions until the end of his presentation, that would be great. And then we'll open it up at 6:45 and we'll have a discussion until a little before 8. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, once again, I'm Justin Iverson. I manage the groundwater section here out of Salem. And again, want to take about half an hour and do two things. I'd like to give a background or a foundation on some key groundwater concepts, make sure that we're all on the same page and nodding along to how the physical system works. And then we'll transition into the second part of this presentation and talk about some of the issues we found with our current allocation process and some proposed initial solutions, right? Not the solutions, but something that we've come up with at the department to essentially start, give an example of things that we're thinking of, and then the bulk of the meeting will be inviting folks to provide their input and their thoughts along those lines. I want to just re-emphasize the one pager or the back and forth that we've got here on the hard copy for the folks in the room. It's available to anybody online through the link that was on the very first slide of the presentation. You can also get that from our website for the hot topics and groundwater allocation project, and then a link called Timeline. You can find that. That has a number of the key presentations that we have given to the commission starting back in October 2016. And I want to acknowledge that I'm going to try to condense 6 or so commission meeting presentations, probably half hour to an hour plus each, into 1 half-hour time period. So I am necessarily going to give a really broad overview. Everything's going to be generalized and simplified to fit into this format. I want to acknowledge there's a lot of details that are in the background. A number of those you'll be able to find by going to that one pager, finding links to the commission staff reports, to the presentations that have been recorded. Those are all out there and available. And of course, happy to chat at any point about those. So we've got a lot of details to work out in this process, and we're looking forward to your input. All right, so with that, we're going to go to the first part of the presentation. Going to talk just super basics. What is groundwater? Talk about groundwater in the hydrologic cycle, and then we'll talk about the source of groundwater to wells, which is how we mostly access and how we permit groundwater in the state. I'll start out with one of my favorite pictures. This is just a random unnamed spring that flows out of the hillside to the Metolius River, about 200 CFS. That is groundwater discharging to surface water, and that happens all across the state. So my first volley of groundwater surface water connection, that's where we're going to be headed this whole time. So first, what is groundwater? At its basics, we're not talking about underground lakes or rivers in Oregon. There might be a few submerged lava tubes out there, but for the most part in Oregon, water is existing in pore space between sands, gravels, and or in fracture space in volcanic rocks. Okay, it is laterally extensive. When folks talk about green infrastructure, I have a predilection to thinking about groundwater and this amazing distribution system we have, by which generally potable water is generally available almost anywhere once you sink a well. Want to point out on this, again, simplified graph, a cross section looking kind of into the upper layers of the earth that, oops, that's not going to work. See if I can get a pointer. There we go. That right here, the schematic from the USGS kind of describing what groundwater is, shows that groundwater and surface water are coincident, and surface water is in many, many places a surface expression of the water table. Okay, and water can flow back and forth between the two depending on the gradient there driving the flow. Right. So groundwater is part of the hydrologic cycle. Okay, it's a dynamic moving piece where in the hydrologic cycle you have precipitation, that rainfall, that melting snow soaks into the ground and it flows. It's going somewhere. It's flowing through the ground, and that flow path has an endpoint, and that endpoint in many cases is springs and direct seepage to streams, which are generally at the lowest point of the elevation. So as part of the hydrologic cycle, before any development took place, groundwater is part of the flowing system, the cycling system. Okay. I think, yeah, I'll say again, also, that in this water cycle over a long time period, we generally have groundwater in dynamic equilibrium. So, so the amount of water that's going into the system at various points over the long run is balanced by the amount of water going out of the system, right? You can fill up storage in that pore space to some point, but you can't fill it up past where the earth material is, and generally you get outflow before it tops out at the ground surface, or else we'd just be living in a big lake. So dynamic equilibrium, and what comes in generally comes out. So I'm going to take an even more simplified picture here. Again, zooming in on this interaction I'm talking about, whereby there's recharge from land surface down to the water table, water flows as these arrows show, and discharges to streams. And once we put a well into this system, and these are a set of diagrams, again, most of these diagrams are from USGS sources, and they're noted on the bottom of the slides here, so you can reference them. This one's from a circular called Groundwater and Surface Water, a single resource. Once we install a well into that existing groundwater system and draw water out, the dynamics, they change a little bit over time. So in general, when we start pumping, well, not in general, but every time, we lower the water level in the well, and that lowers the water level around the well. And that water table bends down to the well, and that's known as the cone of depression. And that lowering of the water table at early times when the well is turned on is pumping water from that pore space. We're actually dewatering a bit of pore space, as you can see on this figure. But that lowering of the water table is what drives groundwater to that well. So groundwater works under pressure gradients, similar to temperature or heat, moves from high heat to low heat. Electricity moves from high voltage to low voltage. Groundwater moves from high potential, which is a mixture of elevation and pressure, to low potential. So by putting in this well and drawing water out and lowering the water table, we create a low potential and and water that was otherwise flowing through that system flows to that well. And over longer periods of time, that cone of depression spreads out until eventually, in many cases, it reaches a surface water body, it reaches that stream, and then water is being met at that point, not very much by any more dewatering of the pore space, but by water flowing to that system from that surface water body. Okay, so over long periods of time, the amount of water we get from storage, from dewatering pore space in this unconfined system reduces, and the amount of water we get captured from water that would otherwise discharge to stream flow increases, right? And over time, the proportion of water from capture is going to grow until most of the water collected by the well fits that mechanism, right? It's water that's captured that would otherwise discharge to the stream. So this was recognized way back in the 1940s by one of the real founding technical minds in hydrogeology, Charles Tyson, and we put this quote up often from the standpoint of groundwater conservation and statutory or the regulation. The following point should be emphasized. All water discharged by wells is balanced by a loss of water somewhere. So again, the system was in dynamic equilibrium. It's a great conveyance system. We tap into that system with wells, but we're pulling water out that was going someplace. And that someplace, again, often to streams, and those streams are relied upon. So we recognize that by pulling water out of wells, we're balancing that loss of water somewhere. Again, that loss is discharged to streams, and those streams are relied upon. And they're, in general, today, fully allocated. So call that the no free lunch principle. And given that principle, then hopefully we can imagine that with our groundwater allocation process over the past 65 years, has over time and cumulatively contributed to groundwater level declines and reduced surface water base flow in many areas of the state. And that this happens at the expense of senior users. And again, we have a Western water law prior appropriation doctrine system, and we want to be protective of those senior users. Okay, so that's the problem statement, is how do we go forward with a groundwater allocation process that is protective of senior users. So with that, I'm going to step into section 2 of my presentation here and talk about some allocation issues and, again, some potential solutions, some things to provoke thought and feedback. So quick overview of the section. I'm going to talk about some issues arising from our existing allocation process. It's not going to be all the issues, just a couple key issues. And again, some initial ideas for updating the allocation process. So I've put this plot up a couple of times, should have pointed out, this is a map that summarizes an assessment of concerning groundwater conditions across the state. There is a lot more information in the June 2021 Commission report. And I would encourage you to go there to see everything that goes into classifying all these little squares or townships or 36 square mile areas. But in general, we have these areas around where we have groundwater data, and the darker the red color, the more concerned we are about something somewhere in that township. And in looking at how we have allocated over the past decade, we've seen that in more than 70% of cases in which we receive an application for a new groundwater permit, we have a positive result. We issue that permit. And further, in these areas that are red or dark red of concern or significant concern, about 80% of the applications are approved. Okay, so on the whole, there's a pretty good chance of a new application being approved. And many of these applications, again, are in areas where we have over appropriated surface water, or we have some sort of groundwater level decline. So this, I think, was really one of the key findings that led to our commission asking us to take a closer look at the groundwater allocation process. So why is that in general? Like why do we find that we have this situation where most applications lead to a issuance, and that's because I believe our well, I know that our statute and our rules and our policy lead us there, and in general, how they are set up, they look at what data is available. Do we know if the system is over appropriated or not? And in order for us to look at that, data must exist. So this is this graphic that's up on the screen is a screenshot of a real life water right application down in the South Willamette Valley. I pulled this up before back in the October 2016, or excuse me, the August 2017 presentation. Again, I should cross-reference that. If you'd like more detail, you can always go there. But in this case, we have an applicant that's kind of off by themselves, where we don't have any data in the hills, south end of the Willamette Valley. And the nearest water level data we have is far to the north, 3 miles-ish. And so in this case, under our existing system, we would take a look and say, well, we don't have any immediate data there. And we would recommend our technical review would say, we don't have data available. If a permit is issued, we'd like to gather data there, right? We'd like to see what's there. Maybe we have permit decline conditions where we say we put some limits on some of the potential consequences of developing there. We say, please collect groundwater level data and provide that back to us so we can understand better for the next time, and that goes forward. So further, when we look at potential of this well to interfere with surface water bodies, so it's kind of hard to see, but the coast fork of the Willamette kind of runs down thus in the picture. We take a look at impacts within a mile of the well. So in this case, that larger dotted line is a 1 mile radius, and it does impact that stream. And so we would take a look at potential for substantial interference with that stream. There's another smaller creek that runs on the other side. Oops. Pointer here that runs along the other side. Outside of a mile, we wouldn't analyze it. So I want to take a look at some of the implications of not having data close to a potential application, and even if we did, what that would mean, and then also taking a look at how we estimate interference with surface water. So just concept number one. So let's even just say that we have water level data near a new application. As we look at it and we look at our rule set, we look at that water level data and we say, is the water level reasonably stable? That's the statutory language, our level of assessment. So this is a set of wells on the left. You'll see them roughly located just in relation to the Mount Angel Groundwater Limited area in the Mid-Willamette Valley. The gray lines, just for reference for a township, that's 36 square miles. So a number of wells, one of them inside the limited area, others adjacent, and the hydrograph of water levels over time in those wells is on the right. And in this case, water levels started out at an elevation of about 100 feet above mean sea level back in the 90s. And today they're down closer to 50 to 60 feet. So that's a decline over that time period of 40 to 50 feet. We do have some definitions of excessively declined, and in this case, I believe that it's relatively easy to see that that is unlikely to be construed as reasonably stable, right? But things get much more ambiguous in other parts of the state. So I'm going to take a second example. This is in the Deschutes Basin. This is a series of wells spanning from the west side of the basin here near the Cascade Crest, past the town of Sisters, across what we call the Sisters Fault Zone here. It's a demarcation in the next slide. Further east across Redmond over to Powell Butte. Okay. And these wells are all in what we call the Deschutes Formation regional aquifer system. And they have pretty dissimilar trends depending on how close they are to the recharge zone in the Cascades or how far. And just taking a look at the top set of hydrographs here. And again, this is a little bit different. I'll say that on the y-axis, we have a change in water level from a baseline. So we normalized all these water levels to a 0 point starting in 1995 and looked at how those water levels changed from that point, plus or minus, over time. And so we have a series of wells that have risen 20 feet, fallen another 20 feet, up and down again. They generally follow what we would consider a decadal climate cycle. And so that could be called reasonably stable, right? Things are moving and they're moving tens of feet over the years, but over a long period of record, they've ended up, about 10 feet higher than they were in 1995. And so great, we're in good shape. But then again, it gets kind of more and more ambiguous. So this red line is a well that's within the Sisters Fault Zone, so headed to the east. It follows the trend for a decade or so, and then it kind of falls off the trend. And what is that? We have a series of reports from the Deschutes Basin that say that changes in water level trend are some combination of climate, the impacts of pumping, the impacts of canal lining. And somewhere in that balance, we see kind of a change from our trend. There's another set of wells further east that are dropping at about half a foot a year. Again, how do we construe reasonably stable? Another set of wells even further to the east, dropping a foot or more a year. So one of the concepts we've looked at is, well, can we come up with some definition of reasonably stable such that when we see these things, we have a consistent way to say yes and no, right? For many years, the answer was yes, it looks reasonably stable, it looks reasonably stable. And as our period of record has grown, we've gotten more and more concerned over this set of wells and whether that still can be construed as reasonably stable. Okay, gonna change gears just a little bit. I'm gonna go back to the Mid-Willamette Valley, back just north of the Mount Angel Groundwater Limited area, show hydrograph for a number of other wells. And these wells look quite different from the basalt wells that I had in the first construct of this picture. And they're going all up and down a bit, and there's a pretty wide range. However, they're all relatively stable. I would say they're all pretty flat. And the reason for that is that all these wells are shallower wells. So those first wells I showed were basalt, they were deep. They were further from these stream systems. These are shallower wells in the sediments near these streams. And so in this case, more efficient hydraulic connection to surface water, more capture of through flow than capture of actually draining storage in the aquifer. So in this case, water level is relatively stable. The water that's being pumped from those wells is coming from water that would otherwise be flowing to these stream systems. So that begs a couple of questions because these stream systems are fully allocated or over allocated. There's no water available for new surface water appropriation, and our water master regulates back these streams. So how should we take a look at a new application in this area where, again, a new well is likely going to take water that was otherwise flowing to these streams that are otherwise being used by senior surface water users. So I want to just refresh again the very generalized block model for the area that these wells we believe are taking water that would otherwise have flown to these streams. And then I want to make this real by saying that right now, and I've pointed this out in other presentations, I would reference the December 2021 presentation to the commission, that right now our rules are set up to assess relatively short-term impacts to surface water bodies from wells that are quite close. So our rules are set up to prevent acute impacts, but they are not set up to take a look at long-term or cumulative impacts very effectively. So this plot is jumping back over the Cascades to the Deschutes Basin in an area where we have a computer model that can simulate the groundwater flow system. And in this particular plot comes out of an application by an applicant to develop additional water from a well. And the question was, what impact is that going to have on streams? In this case, we could use this numerical model, which we don't have across the state, but in this case, we use the numerical model. We have simulated this well turning on. We have looked at the simulation of the water that would otherwise flow to streams, decreasing over time. And so on the x-axis here, we have months, which is kind of confusing, but this is about a 30-year period. We turn the well on about here at month 49. We take a look at the source of water to that well as stream depletion, which is on the y-axis here, as a percentage of pumping rate. And so over time, the percentage of the water going to that well again, that comes from surface water, builds. And right now, our current rule and policy has us focus on what's the impact after 1 year. And after 1 year, the impact is about 3% of the pumping rate. And we say, okay, great, that's your impact to the stream. And right now, the rules don't look at this building impact. Get the pointer back up here, that builds over the years up to, in this case, 90% of the flow to that well after 30 years, we are simulating comes from captured surface water. Okay, so that is Tice's principle from 1940 that we're kind of shunting to the side, that we've shunted to the side with our existing system. So when we take a look at that long-term impact and the impact of not just that well, but all the wells that have authorized permits over the last 65 years, we can understand that we are incrementally affecting, again, surface water flows, especially in the summer months. And so this is a map that's been shown many times from the output from our water availability reporting system, showing available stream flow for new surface water allocation in August. And anything that's in buff means that that watershed is fully appropriated, that the water in that stream, which has a good groundwater base flow component, is fully allocated. Okay. And so again, I'll just bring back to new applications for groundwater rights in these areas that are going to likely have, in many cases, effects on these stream flows. We're only looking at a very short-term impact, and we're looking at just the impact from that single well. So one of the concepts that we put forward again to the commission in March of this year was to, what if we looked at longer term impacts? What if we looked at cumulative impacts? And what if we assess those impacts against surface water availability over time? So that's a thought for modernizing our system, not confining ourselves to impacts within a year, wells within a mile, but the full impact that we've seen cumulatively since we've started issuing permits. I also want to point out on this map that there's a lot of white space in here, or maybe not a lot, there's white space in here. And that's areas where the water availability reporting system doesn't have data or hasn't made estimates. We also wanted to address those items. And one concept for doing that was to look at water master regulation history. So we have water masters across the state. They are the people that folks call if you've got a senior surface water right that's not being met, and the water master will come off and regulate back people with junior priority dates to you. This map is pretty coarse, but we put it up here as we're working on gathering data from all the water masters and putting that into a mapped format, just to show that in these areas, there's at least one stream in each of these basins that's been regulated back a long way, right? Like people with rights from 1900 aren't getting their water in many of these basins in at least one stream. And again, we want to consider those senior users as we continue to allocate groundwater that again is supporting some amount of that stream flow. So with that, I want to wrap up and again invite folks to provide their thoughts and feedback on how we can evaluate groundwater applications for new rights to be more protective of senior users and to be more protective of the resource and its sustainable use into the future. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Justin. And so and the way this is going to work is, like I said, we have 60 people online virtually, and we've got about 20 people in the room. So that's a 3-to-1. And we have a little over an hour for some questions and some input. And when we were planning these meetings, we thought we would reserve the first 10 to 15 minutes for any clarifying questions from Justin's presentation. And then hopefully we can move to input to answer some of the question that Justin has posed. And then also keep in mind that we have the survey that you can fill out if you don't get a chance to speak. And certainly, even if you get a chance to speak, we want to hear what you have to say. And for folks online, you can fill that out online. So can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
So just a reminder for virtual attendees, to enter the queue, you'll use the raise your hand button, and that'll put you in the queue. Bianca will tell me who's in the queue, and then she will unmute you. You'll get a chance to ask your question. We'll all hear it in the room, or you'll be able to provide your input, and then we'll move on from there. And so use your webcam if you can, because then people in the room can see you on the screen, so that's nice. And use the chat to request technical assistance and ask questions only if you can't ask your question orally. And for folks in the room, just raise your hand and I'll see you and call on you. So what's the next slide? Questions and ideas. So let's take the first 10 minutes or so and just see what questions you have, clarifying questions about Justin's presentation. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start within the room. If somebody has a question, we'll start there. And then I'll do a couple questions online. So yes, sir. And please state your name.
Yeah, my name is Will McGill, and I have a question concerning the process of getting a new rule instigated or set in place. So whenever that's appropriate, I want to be sure.
Yeah,
As an input.
he can ask that now.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Go ahead. So for folks in the back, if you're having a hard time hearing, Will, is it?
Yeah.
Has a question about the process, about when the new rules that process would begin.
Okay. We have the unfortunate position of having a client be the first one denied under these proposed rules. Just denied last week. ORS 536 .031 says the Water Resources Department may apply only those rules of the department that are in effect as of the date that the completed application is made for a permit and deciding whether to approve, deny, or impose conditions on the permit. By applying this proposed rule retroactively, put your CWREs in a very, very difficult position. And it causes serious financial damage to the applicant. They paid the water resources fees, they've hired us, paid us. Everything was moving toward approval. Now you've applied this rule retroactively and denied their application. So my question, following on these comments is, at this point, the only way our client can react is to file a protest, pay more fees, hire an attorney. It takes your time, our time. It's not good for anybody. Is there some way we can sit down with the director or department heads or something and figure out a way out of this very bad situation?
So, Will, I'll take a cut at that. It's a good question. Our commission has asked us in the interim, so there are no new rules. There are no new rules that have been adopted, and there are no new rules that have been implemented. This is the very beginning of that new rule process that we're talking about. But in the interim, before the new rules are adopted, and our target would be at earliest next spring sometime, our commission has asked us that in situations where we can't make a positive finding that groundwater is available, and that's really what Justin was trying to get to here, is groundwater available for a new water right such that it won't impact senior surface water rights or pose a threat to over allocation of an aquifer system. In areas where we can't make a positive finding to those two things, they have asked us to stop issuing permits there. And so I think that's probably what your client got caught up in. I suspect a number of other people in the room have questions around this process as we're bridging from today until new rules are adopted. But what we really want to focus on tonight is feedback on the proposals and ideas and concepts that Justin has talked about for the new rules. That's really what these outreach meetings and listening sessions are for. We certainly can sit down with you and your clients on a one-on-one basis to talk about the specific applications that they have and what part of the process they're in. But again, we're working under guidance from our commission. That's basic. Our commission is concerned about this over allocation and injury to senior users and has asked us to stop making things worse.
So Will, I would encourage you then to make sure that you give your contact information to Ivan so that the two of you can connect and set aside a time to talk about this in more detail. Another question in the room? Yes, go ahead. And your name?
Greg Capellas. Well, there's another question kind of related to Will's question, really. I have two questions, really. It's okay. First one is, right now, what percentage of groundwater applications that you've been receiving have gotten a little box checked for cannot be determined? Do you have you know what that is?
So for the folks in the back, the question is, what percentage of applications
Groundwater applications
have the box checked?
Or, that either groundwater is not over appropriated or is over appropriated or cannot be determined. And all of this is based on, my understanding is, the little box being checked that says cannot be determined, essentially. The department is uncomfortable issuing now permits when it cannot be determined. And that's what's happening with these older permits that have been in some cases sitting in the queue for over 2 years, up to 2 years, I would say, and in many cases already gotten positive groundwater reviews. However, the process that was being used before allowed that to happen if that box was checked that said cannot be determined. So my first question is, do you have an estimate of how many of those applications that come in, what percentage have that box checked?
Okay, so.
To give us an idea of how many applications are just gonna get denied now that are sitting in the queue. What percentage?
Sure, I don't have an exact number off the top of my head, and I can't say for sure. I do know that we did talk about this cannot be determined box with the commission in the past. I had a number then, I'm racking my brain for it, but I'll have to get back to you on what that number is. I would like to just take a quick clarify, I understand your question. I want to make sure everybody online and in the room understands the question. So in this example we gave here from the Southern Willamette Valley, where the nearest data sources we had, the wells with water level data, are shown here in green at the north side of the plot. They're 3 miles away from the application, shown with the plus sign with the red circle around it. That would be a place where in the past we have said, the question is the groundwater resource over appropriated? Yes, no, cannot be determined. In this case, where we don't have data in the vicinity, cannot be determined is likely to have been checked in that review situation. So that's an example of a situation that Greg is talking about here. Again, I don't have the exact number. More than 50%, I would venture, but I don't have the exact numbers.
Okay. So my follow-on question that's related to that, if I may. So apparently up until just recently, the department has felt that they did not have the authority to deny an application based on that box being checked, based on a cannot be determined determination. What has changed to give the department now the authority to deny an application on that basis? Can you provide us with a good explanation of that?
We're pointing to the direction from the commission on that. If we can't make a positive finding that water is available.
I mean statutorily or
Well, I don't-
legally.
Yeah, I don't know that it's that we didn't have the authority, right? The question is water available?
Yeah.
And that's the statutory authority, right? Water must be available. And it was the policy of where we were headed on implementing that. Is water available? And the commission direction is what is, as I said, is what changed.
So I'm not seeing any hands raised virtually yet. So I'm going to go ahead and take another couple questions in the room. I saw your hand up, sir, with the blue checkered shirt, and then the man in the back, and then you.
Yeah, Grant McGill. And I had a follow up to Greg's question on kind of something to pile onto that. I appreciate your example with this, like the Southern Willamette Valley, but in our experience, we have, we've gotten maybe 5 applications approved within a 1 to 3 mile radius, and then now have applications that have been stuck, and our saying is they're stuck because of this new rule change. And so while this is a good example in those cases, we're wondering, how have those other ones been approved in such a recent timeline, and then now we don't have groundwater available? And I think what Greg was kind of getting at is that box checked for good reason, or is that because there was no consequence going forward, is that happening more than it should?
Grant, I'm going to jump in there. I'm not sure what you're asking is what happening more than it should.
The box being checked on the groundwater review that it cannot be determined that there's groundwater available or not.
I don't know that it's happening more than it should. It happens in instances, as Justin has indicated, where the hydrogeologist that reviews the application doesn't have adequate data available to him to make a finding. And based on where Oregon's at today with water scarcity, less water available in streams, and over allocation in aquifer systems, our commission's at the point where they're no longer comfortable being as flexible with, the department has to make a determination that water is available. And we're not going to be making that determination as frequently unless we have the data to support it based on direction from the commission. And again, I know there's a lot of people tied up with existing applications, and those are very important to those folks right here and right now. But we really want to focus the questions on the feedback tonight and at these listening sessions on new rules, concepts, ideas that you have, feedback on things that Justin's presented, moving forward and looking to incorporate into either updated rules or new rules that are going to deal with this very issue.
So then my follow-up to that was in Justin's presentation, when we talked about the static water level measurements being the data that you're looking for. And so, as I mentioned, our experience of having a group of applications in a close radius where they've been approved and we're now gathering those static water level measurements. Is that an appropriate solution to getting that data, or will there be another plan going forward to gather that data? Or is that just an area that will be shut down in the future?
I think it's unknown at this time. That's, again, we're looking for feedback from you folks on what would be the appropriate steps in an area where data don't exist. What decisions should the department make to gather the data so that we can come up with a positive finding that water is available for the new application and possibly new ones or additional ones coming down the road?
Thank you, Brent. Go ahead and let us know who you are.
Sure. James Fraser with Trout Limited. Justin, I had a clarifying question about your presentation. About 5 slides before the end, you had a figure that showed a line for the Crooked, the Deschutes, and Wyches Creeks. And I was wondering if those lines show the model percentage of the source for that well. So for example, 16 years out, that it's 50% of the water coming out of that well is from the Crooked, or is it showing that 50% of the Crooked River's flow is going to that well? I think it's the former, but if you could just clarify what that graph is showing.
Yeah, so close to the former, it's essentially it's saying that 50% of the water being pumped from the well, so 50% of the well pumping rate, whether that be 1 CFS or whatever it might be, is not discharging as base flow to the Crooked, right? So in the Deschutes system, the groundwater comes in through the Cascades, dominantly flows through the subsurface, and then that picture that I had of a spring at the Metolius, right? Like that's a real visible example of it coming out of the stream. And again, from that picture I showed, that was about, people have estimated it at about 200 CFS. So if that happened to be a line, right? Metolius, I think, was not actually, I don't think the line on that map. I'd have to go back and look, but basically it's saying that that is water that would have flowed out to those streams that is not flowing out to those streams anymore.
Thank you.
Go ahead, and then we're going to turn to our virtual participants. I see that Kate has her hand up. So Kate, you'll be right after the woman in blue.
My name's Malia Capillas, and I have, well, one point and then one question. My first point is that slide that you showed of the Mount Angel area with the groundwater limited area, your wonderful groundwater decline. I'm very familiar with that area, and a large part of that decline is because of commingling basalt wells. One in particular that I'm very aware of. So that whole decline, if you were making decisions based on that area, it's a false decline because of well construction issues. The other question I have is, I'd like to have an idea of how many areas of the state now, is it large regional areas, or just there, or what type of areas do not have enough hydrogeologic information to make a water right determination? You know, how big is that problem where you're going to easily be able to check the box because you don't have that information? so that we can start working on figuring out ways to get the information for those areas. But I need to know how big is that area.
Okay, so again, I just want to clarify and make sure that I understand, and I'll reiterate for folks in the room to perhaps put some more light. So you're asking about a checkbox in the existing review process.
Well, so where you're gonna mark the box that says we cannot determine.
Yep.
I want to know, is that a significant part of the state?
Yep, so
Where-
yes.
Or is it just small areas that we don't have that information?
So, okay, I'll give you the short answer first, but then I want to expand. So it's a significant part of the state, and the issue is, it comes in line with kind of the definition of overappropriation that goes with these check boxes. And again, I guess I'll flip back here to again, one item that we want to look at among many as we relook at our rules and our definitions and how we're putting policy on top of physical systems is, how do we determine, is water available, right? And so in this case, where you're talking about the checkbox for the overappropriation definitions, we've taken the definition of overappropriation from the Division 400 rules. We have, it's a two-part definition. We've split that out into basically groundwater pumping from storage and groundwater pumping from stream flow capture that we push over to Division 9. And then the definitions of pumping from storage are kind of water budget based. And again, when we look at overall water budgets, we can look at a whole basin's water budget, and we have some information on that. And we know that that doesn't, it's not an evenly distributed system, right? At the basin scale, impacts can be quite localized. And so to understand localized impacts, we need that localized data. And that's, the cannot be determined boxes. We don't have localized data at that location. And that's how, for example, I believe we got in trouble in the Harney Basin is an application came in, we didn't have data available. We said, okay, cannot be determined. We'll issue a right, we'll require water level reporting. And then a new application comes in before we get water level data back, right? We issue another right, and yes, no data available, cannot be determined. Please, not please, it's a condition of your permit, provide us water level data, right? And then the development lags the permitting, and by the time the data starts coming back and showing the impacts of development, we've issued more water rights than the resource can sustain. So
Thanks for your question. I'm going to go ahead and move to our virtual participants. We did have a question in the chat. Justin, I've got it up on the screen here. And then Kate, I said that you were right after our woman in blue. So if you can be right after this question in the chat. And I see that you put your hand down, so I want to make sure, Kate, you are still in the queue. So the question in the chat here is at the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned what wells are exempt. Could you give examples of what types of wells are we talking about? Municipalities, commercial, industrial, farming?
okay. So Ivan touched on this at the very beginning. There's a number of groundwater uses that by statute are exempt from the permitting process. And so these wells don't go through this review process we're talking about. It includes domestic uses, a limited 5,000 gallons per day or less for a single industrial commercial use. It includes stock watering. It includes irrigating up to 1/2 acre of non-commercial lawn and garden, has some other exemptions. Reference there is Oregon Revised Statute 537545, I believe. And folks can go take a look at exactly what that says. Essentially, that statute says that these, they're relatively small volumes and they're relatively commonly used. So anybody with a piece of rural property that's off of a municipal or quasi-municipal delivery system has likely an exempt use well supplying water to that property. Okay, those wells make up rough numbers, 90% or more of all the well logs that we have received in the state are for exempt use wells. And the USGS puts out water use summaries on 5-year increments. The last summary that we have available from 2015 indicated that those exempt uses were roughly 3 to 5% of total use. So it's a relatively large number of wells and individuals that own that wells, a relatively small number of the total use. And those uses, again, are statutorily exempt from this allocation process we're talking about.
Let me jump in there real quick. To Sarah's question, to spin that around a little bit, I think what you may be asking, this process, again, is not dealing with the exempt uses. Those are 90% of the wells in the state, but only 3-4% of the actual groundwater use in the state. This process is dealing with the other 10% of the wells. These are the large uses. In Oregon, that's largely agricultural and irrigation uses, 80 to 90%, depending on the basin you're in. Municipal uses, industrial uses, or larger group domestic or quasi-municipal uses that exceed these smaller amounts here that are exempt from permitting in the statutes.
Thanks for that, Ivan. I want to do, so Kate, I see that hopefully you're still in the queue. I'll call on you in just a minute. For folks in the room, we have several seats up around the table. You're welcome to come up. You're also welcome to just bring your chairs closer. I mean, we've got another almost an hour of conversation. I want to make sure you can hear and that you're feeling like you can be part of the table up here. So we only had a handful of folks say they were going to be here in person, so we set the room up accordingly. But you're welcome to come on up and be around the table closer. And do just let me know if you can't hear, and we'll be happy to repeat the question. So Kate, did you still want to ask a question or provide some input?
Good evening. Yes, Kate Ely here with the Umatilla Tribes, and I have many questions, but it all circles around. You're asking the audience to come up with ideas about how to protect senior water users, both surface water, groundwater, from impacts from permitted wells, new permitted wells. And I'm just wondering, this is something that you guys have been thinking about for a long time. And what ideas have you come up with? What thoughts about rules and distribution of those rules across the many different basins that you would implement these rules? I mean, every basin is different. It has a unique set of groundwater conditions and surface water interaction and such. So one size does not necessarily fit all. So I'm wondering if you were thinking in developing rules on a regional basis, on a basin basis, statewide basis, and then also thinking about, gee, what has the world done? Have you looked at other states and modeled for groundwater allocation where data is not available? So sorry, I think I'll go into the survey and ask my questions of you folks at another time. And thank you. I have to thank you very much for reaching out to people and offering so many evenings for discussion and ideas sharing. So thanks. That's all.
Appreciate your question, Kate. Justin, Ivan?
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer that in two parts. So Kate, thanks for your comments. So we had these three initial concepts that I just presented, right? So to review those, some things that we're thinking of that we are trying to formulate a good policy around is, okay, with respect to pumping down dynamic storage, similar to what's happening in the Harney. First of all, we have a statutory statement in our Groundwater Code 1955 from the legislature that says we'll determine and maintain reasonably stable water levels. So determining that is the first part. And again, we've determined what's not reasonably stable in rule, but we haven't necessarily determined what is. And that's something that we're certainly talking about. And the duration of the record, as well as the magnitude of decline, are all things that we are wrestling with and really want to get people's input on, right? Is reasonably stable mean no decline? Does reasonably stable mean what? You know, are we willing, or are folks comfortable essentially mining out some of that water, understanding that that is going to have impacts on domestic well users, homesteads? Those are the folks that typically are the first ones to have wells not produce the water that they need. So we end up with situations like down in the Klamath where we've had hundreds of folks with wells that are failing, and then the work to fix that. So if we want to help prevent that happening over time, what do those values look like? And that's the type of information we're looking. And then on the other side of the source of water to wells, the stream flow capture, we, in many parts of Oregon, given the hydrogeologic setting, water from wells was otherwise going to go to stream flow, and it has been being used by, especially in the summer months when groundwater makes up a large proportion of the flow of many streams without a snowpack or a dam above them. How are we protective of those senior users? We're already regulating back folks with priority dates, 1900, 1850s. Folks with time immemorial water rights in the Klamath are not getting their usual and custom amount of water. So knowing that if we issue a new right today, we're going to incrementally decrease that surface water flow that's already not being met for a senior water user, how do we balance that with the fact that that's also the source of water for rural development, right? There's a hard balance there, and we're looking for folks' input on what is that balance, right? Do we, how much is too much? Is any incremental increase too much? Is, do we feel impassioned that we want to keep some of that, right? We want to collect input on that. So that's just I think that Kate understands, and I'm saying that more for the general audience.
Yeah, yeah.
Those are the type of feedback that we'd like. So thanks, Kate, for that opportunity.
So I'm going to pause for a minute to see if there's somebody else that has a question before we hear a second question. Yes, man in the back with the hat. If you can let us know who you are.
My name's Jimmy Lee. I farm down in Lynn County and have developed quite a few new water rights over the last 8 years. Grow hazelnut trees on heavy clay soils, and we have a water problem where we have too much water, so we can drain it and just pump a little bit of water on the sun will drip. My question is, if I buy a neighbor's farm and I want to develop hazelnuts, when you have your little box about cannot be determined, is that going to be 1 mile, a half a mile, 100 feet, 3 miles, 5 miles? Because if I'm going to go develop a farm and make it productive, and carbon credits and all this stuff, that's a huge risk for someone like me that for 7 years ago, we've done reports, the water levels 8 feet every year in March. I mean, there's lots of water. So how is that determined right now? Currently, is it 1 mile from cannot be determined on your box with the hydraulic report when you want to develop a new property? Or is it just depend where you're at the state, or
Yeah,
when you mark that box?
so there is no set distance criteria currently. And both the rate and magnitude of the expansion of a cone of depression from a pumping well is variable depending on the ground surface you're in. So I'll go back to Kate's comment of things are different in different parts of the state. That's very true. And I think that's one reason why we don't have a number right now. and it's difficult to choose one. I'll also hasten to say, the 1 mile, I'll clarify, that is stated in rule, and that's for the impacts of a well on surface water. So we are limiting those to wells within 1 mile, but that's the groundwater to surface water impact, not necessarily what are the water levels doing and is the resource over appropriated or not. And I guess one thing that I'm hearing from you that we're certainly cognizant of is in creating these rules, we should strive to understand and make a transparent process where folks can assess and understand what the outcome is likely to be, right? That's important. And I hear that.
Well, I guess, Justin, I think the other one that I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds a little bit similar to what you said, Grant, is there's a geographic sort of a proximity consideration is what I'm hearing that maybe not be taken into account right now. Is that a fair? Because that was kind of your comment too, Grant, right? It was like
Yes.
the
It's
proximity.
taken into account on a case-by-case basis,
Okay.
by the hydrogeologist reviewing the application.
There was one more question over here. Yes, sir. And then woman in blue, I can't remember your name. You'll be next. And for virtual attendees, please go ahead and get in the queue with your hand up so we know that you're there, and I'll be sure to call on you. Yeah, go ahead.
Roger,
Let us know who you are.
Pardon?
Oh, let us know who you are.
Yeah, so I was trying to.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Roger Ruckert, down near Tangent. Couple of questions. So the box that where you can't determine, or you don't have the history. But we could also say there might be a lot of water there, but just because you can't determine it.
Mhm.
See, that's the part that bothers me, because it seems like if I'm the developer, I'm taking the risk, and I put it down a couple dry wells. That's pretty expensive. And we put the well down, we do a test pump on it, and we monitor it every March. We report those levels. And so it seems like you're arbitrarily denying someone an opportunity to develop their farm. And we all are aware that the population is going crazy. The amount of land is decreasing. And to feed the world, we've got to increase our production. And that's one of the best ways is to develop water so that we can grow a variety of crops and stuff. And my neighbor is 3 miles northeast of Shed. They put a well down in 1954. Shortly thereafter, I believe it's your department, every 3 months, you monitor that level. And is there a whole bunch of other wells around the state that is on that program? And is there a chance that any of those wells are in these areas that you say cannot be determined? See, I have application in that I haven't heard boo about for a long time. And I suspect that this is what's going on, see? And I believe you've got to look at this region in the Willamette Valley a lot different than you look at all the other regions. I mean, we're not the Klamath Basin, we're not Eastern Oregon or Arizona or California. I mean, our levels have been very consistent all over. And my concern is that, well, you know my concern, I've stated it, so thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I'll just reiterate, you're absolutely right. I mean, no information is on it. It's ambiguous, right?
And it's on me if it doesn't work.
Mhm.
And if it affects someone else, well, you will have the authority to limit this. to limit my consumptive use, right? I mean, if it affects a senior water rights person, or if it affects some other body of water, I mean, those things are built in there, see?
So
I mean, it's no
Yes,
risk to you if I do this and there isn't the supply.
Because there are
Yes,
other
yeah.
controls.
that is true. And, you know, I'll say we've had experience, just our recent experience, again, because we've been focused on a few areas of the state, but the Hardy Basin is where we've been pretty intensively focused, one of our areas. And yes, individuals bear that risk, but what we see is that whole economies and communities grow up around that development. And when we find that a system's been over appropriated and that controls need to happen, that creates societal and community impacts beyond just the folks, like certainly the folks that are junior and maybe regulated are going to be impacted, but it ripples out from there.
And Roger, I'll add to that. What we're seeing more frequently and in wider swaths across Oregon is what I call collateral damage. Last year, over 200 dry domestic wells in the Klamath Basin, another 170 have been reported so far this year. Deschutes County, Jackson County, dozens of dry wells in those areas and around the state. Some is drought related, some is groundwater pumping related. The state so far has contributed over $10 million to start helping with that problem. That number is likely to go up. So we've got to understand, and this is where our commission is concerned, that in some cases, we've gone too far, we're on a path to go too far, and there's no good end. And we aren't going to make more water or create more water. And those are the challenging situations that we're trying to stop. So, you know, again, this process isn't going to deal with existing groundwater rights or existing exempt uses. It's really much more forward looking. Should we be issuing more groundwater rights in this particular area if we don't have good information to support the fact that we can do that without this collateral damage or without you making a big investment, that the water master is going to have to show up in 5 years and say, hey, you've triggered a decline condition. I need you to shut off now. We don't want to go there. That's not good business for us or for you. So,
One quick follow-up question if I may is, so do you have maps like Lynn County, because that's where I'm at, that show the areas that you would deem a lack of history or whatever, so we know whether we're in it or not? I mean,
so what we do
only way to
have,
find out is to apply and get denied.
yeah, Justin has provided a map in the presentation tonight that are sort of these groundwater area of concerns around the state. So those are areas where we know something's going on, and some have already been designated critical groundwater areas or groundwater limited areas or have been withdrawn from further appropriation. Here's the map up here. We also have maps, and all of this data is available online, of what we call our observation well network. He asked about wells that get measured every quarter. I think we're measuring somewhere around 1,600 wells across the state on an annual or quarterly basis. So we do have good data in some areas. A lot of that's been focused in areas where development has already occurred. But we're seeing people push out to the fringes of that. And those are the areas where we don't have good data, or maybe not a great understanding of the hydrogeology at times. So to your specific question, we do not have a map set up that delineates areas where we don't have data to that point. But that's one of the questions, is that, again, we're looking for feedback from you. Is a map where we don't have data helpful? Is a map where we don't think we should issue groundwater rights helpful for people planning, buying land, you know, things like that? That's the kind of feedback we're after tonight.
So there's 3 questions in the room, and Theodore and Rachel, I see you have your hands up online. So let's go ahead and go to, is it Jean?
Gene, oh, right. So does the state
are you prepared to budget to put in more observation wells so that you can clear up some of these undetermined areas or areas that you think are being over impacted, but maybe you don't have quite as much data as you'd like to have? Or because you have observation wells, but you're also relying an awful lot on all those marked static water measurements and or those other permits that have multiple requirements through the years, through the process of the year. And then secondly, would you put that take that marked measurement and put it through this, require more measurements through the summer and into the fall in some of those to see how much, a little bit more information about decline through the summer, and then compare that decline to the recharge that you're seeing in March. So yes, the decline may be there. It may still be tolerable because the aquifer does recover. But first question is, are you prepared, is the state prepared to pay the money to put in those observation wells and not depend solely on private wells being, because if you're not going to allow people to put in a well for a water right, you're not going to have those wells in those areas that you can't determine.
Yes, so I think it's a matter of degree. So the state does provide about $500,000 a year for us to install observation wells, and we try and target those in areas where we're lacking data, just as you say. A number of those go into the areas where we're doing these intensive studies with the USGS, but it's a statewide program and we've installed wells statewide. Will that get us to where we need to be of having, the detailed net? Not anytime, I think, but it helps. And I hadn't thought about potentially higher frequency water level reporting.
There might need more information about the drawdown in the wells in July and August versus what's happening in the stream. So if the water level isn't drawn down very much, but the stream's already starting to dry up, is it being caused by the wells or is it being caused just by climate conditions that I know are getting worse, obviously, but are still variable as this year was.
Yeah.
So.
No, thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks for that. So there's a man in blue and then woman up front, and then we'll go to Theodore and Rachel.
So, Donaldson Longo, I did have a question about the wells in Planet. What kind of wells were they? Were they mostly domestic? Were they, did they have water rights attached to them? Do we have any data on that by chance?
Yeah, the numbers I reported are for domestic wells. There are also other irrigation wells that were having problems and have had problems over the years, but these are domestic wells that are supplying drinking water for households.
If I could just one follow up with that, I suppose. When it comes to trying to monitor how much water these domestic wells have, we don't really have any kind of ways to measure that, do we? Like, we don't measure how much water they're taking out of the ground or anything like that, or how deep they are.
That's correct. Yeah, the actual water use from exempt wells with rare circumstances isn't measured or reported.
Thank you, Dante. Yeah, go ahead and ask your question. And then Theodore and Rachel, you're on deck.
This is Malia Capillas again. Building on what Kate said or asked is, are there any other options? And in response to Ivan's comment that we can't make more water, I would like to say we can store water, because one of our biggest problems in this state is we have lost a lot of our rechargeability with our county ditches and drain tiles in the fields. We're losing a lot of our recharge that used to naturally go into these aquifers and feed them. And so I don't see why we couldn't develop some kind of statewide system based by watersheds where we focus on artificial recharge and aquifer storage and recovery projects, not on individual by farmer basis, but on more of a watershed basin perspective, so that we could allow these water rights and we would be recharging the additional water that they would need to make up for that cumulative impact, because it's not drop for drop on these streams, because part of that water that's irrigated does go back down and become part of the system again. It's just changing its travel time to make it back to the Pacific. But through ASR and AR, we could make a huge difference in this. I mean, we could be recharging the Klamath, we could be recharging the Willamette Basin. And in a lot of these areas, when I look at them, we don't have a lot of prime farmland left that does not already be covered with water rights. And if we, sorry, it's time for our cat's insulin shot. Okay. I just lost my track. So, you know, we could be making a huge difference by doing all of this, but do it more on a regional basis so that you can pick the best places for doing an artificial recharge. I mean, Idaho is a textbook case of how much water they're recharging now into their aquifer systems. And that's not the only place in the country that's doing this kind of thing. And it would literally, if we could go that direction, it would make these rules that you're working on completely unnecessary.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Maria. So online, Theodore, you had your hand up, but it's gone now. Are you still on deck and wanting to share some input? If not, then we'll move to Rachel. Hi, Rachel. Thanks for getting on. Let us know more.
Hi. I just wanted to comment and then a question. Ivan, to your statement about whether or not a map would be helpful showing where there is and is not a groundwater availability. I think that something like that would be really helpful if once the department figures out how they're going to determine that. I think putting out a publicly available map would be really helpful. And I appreciate the concepts that the department put forward today. I think it would be useful to have a little bit more definition around, or just to present a little bit more around how those concepts would actually be used in practice. And maybe there's just a one-pager document or something like that that just goes into a little more depth as here's the data that we would look at, and here's how we would use that data to make determinations. And then my question is, on concept 1, reasonably stable, I'm curious as to how you would come up with or apply that definition in basalt versus alluvial aquifers. Would there be a reasonably stable level just for alluvial aquifers or for basalt as well, and sort of how that would work in places where there's groundwater use in both types of aquifers?
Justin or Ivan, is there anything to reply to Rachel, or is it more?
I was going to ask Rachel how she'd answer her own question. We just haven't gotten into the level of detail, Rachel, on some of these questions about would there be a statewide definition of reasonably stable? Would it vary by geological type or aquifer type? Would it vary by basin? Those are all considerations. And again, we're sort of looking to you folks. Do you see or have good ideas or concepts that could be employed to help us allocate groundwater in a responsible fashion that's going to protect senior users, surface water and groundwater users around the state? We don't want to injure them or impact their source of water any more than it's been impacted, and also help us sustain these reasonably stable groundwater levels in the system there. We recognize that basalt aquifer systems behave much differently than an alluvial aquifer system than they do with fractured bedrock on the south coast or north coast. So we do have a good understanding there. But at the end of the day, water levels declining year after year, eventually will have an impact. We have to acknowledge that and recognize it. A lot of these aquifer systems, we don't have a hard bottom on. We don't know how deep they go. We do recognize that with increasing depth, we increase salinity. Eventually, we run into warmer water. Basalt aquifers in the state of Washington have encountered this. They've been chasing water levels down there for decades. And we also, at some point, run into an economic challenge of lifting the water. It costs so much money to pump it up from such deep depths that it's no longer feasible. So, we don't have answers, Rachel, to your question right now, but again, we're really looking for input. Suggestions tonight are great, but I know this is a lot to take in. We do have the online form, and you can certainly email Justin or I anytime. If things are unclear, happy to have discussions with you about them. But this is really going to be an ongoing conversation. And again, we're looking forward to input from you on these topics.
Hey, Rachel, can you let us know if you're with the organization or a farmer or a municipality?
Sorry, couldn't unmute myself there. Yeah, I am with the organization Environmental Defense Fund based in Portland.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks. And thanks for your response, Ivan. That was really helpful.
Okay, Theodore, you're up. Go ahead and unmute yourself and do let us know who you are and who you're with, if you're with an organization or municipality or farmer, industry.
Sure. I'm Ted Ressler with Summit Water Resources, consultant. So I guess I was thinking about the comments that have been made about these. I'm focusing on these areas where there isn't data available to make a decision. And the challenges with trying to then gather information from those areas, because you've sort of stated that the way that you've tried to gather data in areas where there isn't any is you take the opportunity for the applicant and the permit as a way to gather then data in that area. And I think that's pretty good. I see the reasoning for that, and that's a good way to gather data. Have you given any thought to these areas where there are these data gaps to establishing like an allocation of a certain number of applications that may be tolerable for the purposes of gathering data? And then if those users don't seem to be negatively affecting after a certain number of period of time, you can allow a bigger allotment of users in those areas so that you're not completely, because I guess what I'm worried about is in these areas that there isn't data. You've said as much that it will take a while to get enough data to sort of make a decision. And that's really going to hamper some, especially agricultural development in some of these areas, because you can't wait for decades to get enough data to make a decision.
Hey, Ted, you can't see it, but we all are writing that down.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for that comment, Ted. I think that's another great idea that we've recorded. I can say we've taken that approach in areas, again, I'll go back to the Harney Basin because that's where we've had some pretty intense focus lately. Some areas outside of our study area that have a similar geologic subsurface conditions to the west near Hampton Buttes, to the south near the Oregon-Nevada border. And we have essentially done just that. We've issued one and denied the second or third that have come in. I appreciate that you brought that up independently, and it's a real good idea, and we'll think about that also in the context of the prior appropriation system, because I think along with that idea, we also need to understand who's next in line and how we go about holding that place in a prior appropriation.
Grant, and then, yes, the woman in the back, but we'll have Grant and then you'll be next.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on an idea. I know we have the allocation to conserve water program where that only really applies to someone who's trying to spread out water rights on additional acres and has enough conserved water to give up a portion to the state. Could we, going forward, most of the new applications we're applying for standard rate of irrigation, but then installing a very efficient system like drip. Is there ways we can incentivize those and continue proving those to, one, get wells with groundwater data conditions like static water levels, but allow farmers to continue developing in super efficient ways?
I'm gonna defer to you on this.
Okay, sorry. I guess, Grant, it's gonna be, and people always kind of cringe when I say this, it'd be something that we could look at on a case-by-case basis. I mean, super efficient use on a new 5,000 acre development, still a lot of consumptive use that's gonna occur. So it's really hard to answer that question. Clearly in areas that are already in a decline, so where water levels are going down or where surface water is over appropriated, we're seeing less base flow, and we know we've got hydraulic connection going on. Do we want to continue to incrementally eat into the remaining, say, surface water supply on that? And that's really the question we're trying to answer here. We certainly want to encourage efficient use and water conservation across the state. Those are all good things. But I don't know how it would factor into new allocation. It's a good consideration, but we're still talking about issuing new water rights for some number of acre feet per year. And that's really the question we're after. Even if it's 1 acre foot or if it's 1,000 acre feet, can the department make a positive finding that water is available without injuring other users and without starting some sort of a decline situation in the aquifer?
Yes, woman in the back in the plaid shirt, let us know who you are.
My name is Lisa Brown. I work for Water Watch of Oregon, and there's a lot to think about here. So I'm just going to make 2 points. One is I also like the idea of the map showing, like, once you get through the process, figuring out which areas can support new uses or not. I saw that the state of Utah has a map online that actually shows where it will accept applications for groundwater and where it won't. So I would take the map even to another level there and just say, like, here are areas, where we're still accepting applications, and here are areas where we're not, based on the data and whatever parameters come out of this process. I think that would be helpful for everybody, including the users and the state. On the question of, like, on what time frame should the state be evaluating the impact of surface water? The 1 year, I don't know where that came from. Is that in Division 9? That's in Division 9. So I think that, I don't know what time frame, how far out you could realistically push your analysis, to do an analysis of the impact of groundwater pumping to surface water. But I think in order to be fair to surface water consumptive users, as well as in-stream rights and, the fish and wildlife that depend on our rivers, really we need to look at the impacts from day one as far out as we can look. And then at the edge of that analysis, I think you reevaluate, whether the groundwater pumping is still viable. In other words, it doesn't make sense to issue a groundwater permit that would last forever based on an analysis of the impact of surface water that's only going out 1 year, 20 years, 50 years. At the end of that, you're saying you might be entering the senior service fund reserve, but that seems unfair. So I would ask for like a reset. Whatever the end of your analysis is, you reset and reevaluate that groundwork. That makes sense.
I'm gonna write that down as like, I'm using the word I'm thinking of continuous monitoring. Is that quite right?
Well, I think we need to make sure in perpetuity that the groundwater is not injuring, the groundwater pumping is not injuring surface water. And how you do that, how you set up that analysis, I don't know, and I'll be more articulate in my online comment.
Okay. Thank you for that. Other questions in the room? I'm seeing what to hear. So I'm going to go ahead. Let's go Greg and then Jean. And then folks online, again, I won't know if you want to ask a question if you don't raise your hand. So raise your hand to get in the queue and I can call on you. And also just a time check. We've got about 10, 15, I think we only have like 5 minutes of kind of wrap up next steps. So we've got about 15 minutes left of our conversation, 10, 15 minutes. So Jean.
So we submit March water measures, sag water level measurements. And then you have all these permits that talk about drawdown over 3 years, 5 years, whatever, 25 feet, 50. Does the department ever monitor that and enforce that? So does somebody review all the static water levels that come in consistently?
Yeah, we don't review all of them. In areas where we start to have problems, we take a look at it, or where staff are somehow involved in the area or measuring wells or measuring that particular well. We have regulated people back and in some cases regulated people off because of the decline conditions and are looking to do more of that.
Is that more typical in the southern and eastern part of the state than here in the valley?
I don't know of any here in the valley.
That are being looked at or
Yeah.
that have resulted in the regulation?
That have been looked at, and I'm thinking specific to regulation. I don't recall any personally that have been regulated here in the valley.
Because it's an awful lot of data you're collecting, but is it actually being put to any use?
Great.
Yeah, yeah, I wanted to just reiterate something a couple of other people have said, but as a consultant, water rights consultant, one of the most important services I feel that I can provide my clients is predictability, is to be able to tell them when they come to me, wanting to apply for new water rights, to be able to tell them if I think they can do it. And so anything that you guys can think of that could make the process more transparent, I guess, or that provide information for applicants so that they, or their consultants, so that they can kind of figure out, because with the Division 9 rules and so forth, being familiar with those up until now or recently, we were able to predict, I think, with a fairly high degree of certainty whether or not an application was going to be approved. And that kind of goes back to this, more than 70% of applications are approved, maybe, depending on how many of your applicants have consultants working for them, a lot of, we don't even submit an application if we don't think it's going to fly. So I would encourage you, I can't come up with any great ideas right now, except, the one that was mentioned was, maps showing areas where you just, it's just kind of like forget it, and that would be really useful. And then I wanted to ask you if this process has sort of stimulated maybe some discussions, further discussions in the department about mitigation options. Because right now there aren't a lot of mitigation options, but I think that if we got creative, we could maybe come up with some mitigation opportunities. And I guess I would just encourage that. If we could offer more mitigation options for applicants to mitigate for impacts to surface water.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, woman in the long hair glasses. Let us know who you are.
Hi, I'm Carmen Burright. I'm here just Carmen Burright. But I've been formerly worked for the department on basic integrated water resources planning. in the mid coast, in the lower John Day, and the upper Grand Ronde, and supported a citizen groundwater monitoring effort outside of Benton County. I do want to just kind of flag that I think, while the department needs to be able to make a determination that water is available, and I do think it's a positive determination. I do think that's kind of maybe the wrong standard. I think as a state, we need to be asking who did and is the impact acceptable to us, given that public water is a public resource, and we are kind of, we're at the time, or maybe past the time of easy water or new water. At this point, any additional development will have an impact on the question of whether or not that's acceptable to people. Who makes that determination and how that determination is made? We have statutes and rules kind of setting forth some of that. It's a really complicated determination. I have worked in communities where the state has gone too far and the impacts are incredibly detrimental, and the public will be paying for those for a long time to the tune of many millions of dollars. I think in the state of Oregon, we are advantaged at having groundwater rights in the current California. We're actually kind of ahead of the game compared to other Western states, but we have to be really judicious with how we grant those permits. I would encourage the department to look at and utilize existing statutes such as ORS 536-300, which really the 1955 planning statutes do ask the department to take this more expansive look at a basin scale to understand current and potential future uses and classify uses to meet these many different needs. Surface water is fully, if not over allocated in most parts of the state. There's been a turn to groundwater to kind of foster development. Development has largely, it's been a good thing for Oregon, economically for our communities, but it's come, it can come at a cost. I think we're at 12% of named streams have some degree of, protection for fish and wildlife. And, that's not really a balanced approach at this point. We have no protections for groundwater dependent ecosystems, springs, and things like that. So, these are really complex, interconnected issues. I also encourage the department to think about equity. You said 90% of the wells only consume about 34% of the water. These are oftentimes the shallowest wells. These are vulnerable rural residents who don't have the money to chase the water, frankly. And so I think when we think about the economic pumping level, I think we really should be considering the 90% of users who rely on this as their drinking water resource. So these would be complicated challenges for the department to work through, but I definitely encourage a more holistic look across the basin and a thorough assessment of impacts, not only to current Oregonians, but also future Oregonians. I want there to be water in the state for my son and his kids, and if he has this, and so on and so forth.
All right. Thank you for that. Other comments in the room? Other people online? Our virtual participants are being very quiet. And they help go the hands in the room. Roger, go ahead, and then can't remember your name, but you'll be next.
It's hard to say, okay, but earlier, when Will brought up his situation, and you said, well, your department has directed you such and such, which went against the protocol that you had, right? As far as putting these things on hold without data. And it would seem to me that as a public entity, and in fact, we are your employers, the state, we are the public, and we're working together. And And your integrity in this department has lost a lot with that decision that they have put over you and caused you to do. And I hope you communicate with them that this is a very disconcerting thing. Not just for myself and others that this has happened to, but you know, you got to live within the system and the guidelines that you have now, not what someone thinks is going to be down the road. So thank you for hearing that.
Roger, thanks for that. It's, you know, I think one of the things that is great about coming together in these meetings is people can be forthright and frank. And, you know, you've got the department here saying, tell us what you think. So appreciate you being forthright.
Thank you for hearing.
But yes, go ahead, sir.
Sure, James Fraser from Trout Unlimited. You know, when it comes to the question of a roadmap moving forward in this process, something that's come up a couple times already tonight is that everyone values certainty. And it doesn't matter if you're a farmer that wants to expand and buy property, but you don't know if that property can get a water right, or if you're a domestic well owner that wants to know you're always going to have water coming up your well. And maps provide certainty. You know, that's another thing that's come up multiple times tonight. And there's already been a couple of great maps that you presented. So when it comes to the criteria that you're, you know, looking for in, you know, moving into a rulemaking and everything, I would encourage the department to just use the available information that you have and these maps that you already have to build a map as a starting point, because I think that's going to be a really useful tool. The department's going to make the best decisions, or at least have the best likelihood of making good decisions if they make fully informed decisions. And just using the info that you have, building a map out of it, and presenting that to your RAC. They can then tweak it, but at least they have a starting point. You know, it's like when you sit down to come up with, you know, your thoughts in writing, it's so much easier if you have someone else's information to revise rather than starting with a blank page. I would encourage you to build a map and then provide certainty to the state by using whatever the RAC revises that into.
Thanks, James.
How about online? We've got a few minutes to take another comment or question online from anybody. You just raise your hand and let us know you're there. Oh, keeping track. Okay, well, go ahead.
I just make a quick point there to Roger's point. You know, if you look at the statutes here that require the department to only allocate groundwater within the capacity of the resource to determine and maintain reasonably stable groundwater levels, and to affirmatively find that water is available before they issue a permit. And what we've seen, for example, in the Hardy Basin, where we now have water levels dropping on the west latest, Justin probably does more than 100 feet in some places, you know, 10, 12 feet a year in some places now. You know, this issuing the permits without being able to basically meet those standards that are mandated in the statute is what got the department into these problems. So I think that, you know, taking a more cautious approach that is really contemplated in the Groundwater Act. I mean, I think in 1955, when Oregon passed that Groundwater Act, it was pretty forward looking. You know, like, let's make sure we're doing this in the capacity of the resource. Let's make sure that we're not gonna, you know, plummet the groundwater levels and dry up people's domestic wells and injure the surface water users and so forth. So I just kind of want to counter your concern by saying, I think what they're doing really is what they're doing now really is what was contemplated in the Groundwater Act. And it puts Oregon, I think, in a much better position going forward to be more judicious about how we use this precious.
Thank you for that. And again, you know, we talked about it in the beginning that that we're bringing diverse groups of people together to give input to the department. We're gonna hear different sides, and that's the point. So appreciate you bringing up the counter. We have just a couple minutes left, and we do have some next steps slides. Is your comment real fast?
It's, I just kind of related to next step. I was hoping that the public feedback that you collect will be publicly available.
Yeah, we'll be doing, we're gathering all of this input. We actually haven't talked as a project team about when and how that information will be put out there. But we hear you that everybody wants to know what everybody's saying. So,
You collected our emails, so can we expect something from that?
that's a good, we'll talk about that and figure out how best to respond.
At least a link. or
Yeah,
something.
exactly. And so that way you've got some follow-up. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. But I do want to give it to, I don't know if it's Ivan or Justin is going to say the last words. Our next step slide. Just kind of what you can expect next. There it is. We'll post the meeting summary recording right there. And all these meetings are recorded and they will get posted. The timing of the meeting summary we need to discuss, but we'll get that up there. And then we do have these other meetings coming up around the state and then another opportunity for a virtual meeting. So I think, is there anything else that you want to say?
No, this is, sorry, I haven't reviewed this slide yet. So we're trying to gather with the online form, public comment that's specific to the regional centers we're in. And so there's a little confusing here. Please submit public input by the end of day, October 6th. Well, our last virtual meeting's on October 10th, and that's going to have a couple weeks of public comment associated with it. So you're all welcome to either travel around the state with us and show up in person for some more oatmeal raisin cookies and water. Or alternatively, certainly join in virtually. That's probably much more efficient with your time. And that online public comment form would have opportunities for you to comment for another month or so. So.
One more next step slide.
Yep, and this rehashes the.
Just when the rules.
intro. Yeah, the intro. So to reiterate that we want to gather input from folks ahead of drafting an initial set of rules. Once we do that, we'll go through the normal rule process, which will include a rules advisory committee. I believe on the survey, there's a place to indicate if you're interested in serving on a rules advisory committee. So if you're interested, please let us know that way. And the commission has requested that we move very quickly. And so we have a pretty aggressive time schedule set in front of us to look for rule adoption.
Yeah, thanks for that, Justin. Hey, Kate, I saw that your hand was up. I'm hoping that you have some lovely thing to say in closing.
Well, not anything lovely for closing, just a comment. Since maps were requested for the areas with lacking data uncertainty, I just suggest to add to those maps the geology and the well density, so we can get a perspective of what the existing development is and if there's potential for development given the type of rocks in the area. So that's all. Thank you.
Hey, and we do see that you put it in the chat, so appreciate
Yeah.
it. Great. Well, here we are at 8 o'clock. Thank you all for spending the evening with us and for your pages and pages of input. Do fill out the survey either on a hard copy and send it in or do it online. Like they said, you're welcome to come with us on our statewide tour of water conversations and really appreciate hearing everybody's perspective. So thank you and good night.
Thank you, folks.
And thank you for our
Thank
virtual attendees.
Still go sit